We call him King David. He wasn't born a king. He was born about 1,000 years before Jesus. David has got a lot of microphone time in the Bible. He's mentioned over 600 times in the Old Testament, more than any other character. There are 66 chapters in the Old Testament that speak directly into his life, who he is and what he accomplished. The closest competitor has got 14 chapters in their honor in the Old Testament. Other than that, he's mentioned 60 times in the New Testament. There is, with regards to ages, we can surmise how old he was when he was anointed, how old he was when he killed Goliath. We can guess these things, but the only real facts we're given about his age is that he was 30 when he became king, and he was 70 when he died. That's pretty much the only real numbers that we have. His story is told through 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and the first chapter of Kings. And we can see so much here, but we've got to acknowledge that if we're going to learn about the tests that he went through, there is a vital character that is his nemesis. Unfortunately for all of us, his nemesis started out exactly the same way he did. His nemesis was the King Saul, and the King Saul was a madman that dedicated his life to making David's life difficult. But King Saul was chosen by God. He was a soldier. He was a head taller than everyone else. He was the logical choice to be a king. But because he couldn't pass his tests, his failure made him the temptation and the test of David. And so as we evaluate the situation of David, we got to evaluate whether we're David or Saul in our own story, whether we're becoming a David or a Saul in our own story. And there's always a hope for redemption. Saul was the first king after the reign of the judges in Israel. The Israelites begged God for a king. They went through a series of judges. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work. The judges were there to lead Israel, and they were called judges because always Israel had one king and one king only. That's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But their judges failed them, and they failed themselves. So after Samuel, they begged for a king. They got Saul, and he was chosen because of his strength, his prowess. He was also a shepherd boy. He was chosen for what they saw, and what they saw they liked. And God burnt his fingers, and he said later on that he regretted appointing Saul to his position because he never took the opportunity to grow. And God, we see in how he chose and how he molded David, he was 100% sure of one thing. He wasn't going to have another Saul lead his people. And he was determined to knock the Saul out of David. Because the reality, the weaknesses of Saul that we're going to examine as we see the test that David went through, every single one of us have the potential of being a Saul. Every one of us have the potential of belittling those around us to make us feel strong, of manipulating people around us so that we can win, of being insecure and being proud and being focused on how we look and what people think of us. Every one of us run the risk of being a Saul. I want to mention a book. You can't have it. I know you're already thinking you want it. You can't. Go buy it yourself. The Tale of Three Kings. It's an easy read. You'll read it in 2 hours. Written by a man by the name of Gene Edwards, one of the most amazing storytellers I've ever read in my life. And it's the story of how David is molded and challenged by a very, very not nice king. And later on, how David's son Absalom also tries to take his throne. And just the hardship he goes through, as many people would call the school of brokenness or the school of suffering. I want to spend maybe 3 minutes reading an excerpt in the intro as we paint a picture of the normalcy of David as a young man, as he is prepared to be chosen to this difficult life. The youngest son of any family bears two distinctions. He is considered to be both spoiled and uninformed. Usually little is expected of him. Inevitably, he displays fewer characteristics of leadership than the other children in the family. He never leads, he only follows, for he has no one younger than him on whom to practice leadership. So it is today, so it was 3,000 years ago, in a village called Bethlehem, in a family of 8 boys. The first 7 sons of Jesse worked near their father's farm. The youngest was sent on tracks into the mountains to graze the family's small flock of sheep. On those pastoral jaunts, the youngest son always carried 2 things, a sling and a small guitar-like instrument. Spare time for a shepherder was abundant on rich mountain plateaus, where sheep graze for days in one sequestered meadow. But as time passed and days became weeks, the young man became very lonely. The feeling of friendlessness was always roamed around inside, and it was magnified. He often cried. He also played his harp a great deal. He had a good voice, so he often sang. When these activities failed to solace him, he gathered up a pile of stones and one by one swung them at a distant tree with something akin to fury. When one rock pile was dissipated, he would walk to the blistered tree, reassemble his rocks, and redesignate yet another leafy enemy and yet a farther distance. He engaged in many such solitary battles. The slingsman, singer, shepherd also loved the Lord. At night, when all the sheep lay asleep and he sat staring at the dying fire, he would strum upon his harp and break into a concert of one. He sang the ancient hymns of his forefathers' faith. While he sang, he wept, and while the weeping, he often broke forth in abandoned praise until the mountains in distant places picked up his praise and tears and passed them on to higher mountains still further away. We see this incredible story of a young boy ostracized by his family, left out by his family, wandering the hills. And very often this is where the trials of David are preached. He could kill Goliath because he practiced on lions and bears. That's where it ends. But we don't even begin there because the picture is so much bigger that in the story that we're about to be told. The important thing to note that before David even comes on the picture, Saul is told by God that he's no longer his man. And he's basically fired. In 1 Samuel 15, a chapter before David comes on the scene, Saul is judged, he's weighed, he's measured, and he's found wanting. And God says to him, "You are no longer my man. I reject you as king. I have chosen another." Saul's response is, "Please just come with me to my people so that they can see me with you and I can worship God." The prophet Samuel says, "I will not go with you." Turns his back on him. All Saul can think of is, what will the people think? He doesn't walk away. He makes every excuse, even though he recognizes the hand of David, to block and cover and cuss for his wickets, to keep him out as long as he possibly could. This wasn't a mystery to Saul. Saul knew exactly what he was doing. David is anointed. What happens? Samuel goes and he calls Jesse, who was a lowly farmer, not a very rich man, in the town of Bethlehem. And he says, "I want to see your sons." Jesse parades the boys in front of him, all 7 of them, from the first to the 7th, more impressive than the first. They're amazing boys. And he gets to the end and Samuel says, "But none of these, don't you have another son?" His father has forgotten about him. He's left him. He said, "Yes, but he's the youngest one. He's out in the field." Samuel says, "We will not sit down." The boys are standing up quickly. "Sorry, sir. We will not sit down until he gets here." So they stand awkwardly around the house, trying to make excuses for why they left out the little redhead, which is what the Bible calls him. Redheads were not common for the people of the day. He was bullied, left out, not included in the family gathering once again, marginalized and mistreated. And he gets there and Jesse anoints him. He pours oil over his head. And we might think, yes, David is king. Hallelujah. He waits at least between 22 and 15 years before he's finally crowned king. And the next 22 to 15 years, I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. And I say between 22 and 15 years because he could have been anywhere between the ages of 8 and 15. And he was only crowned at 30. And so in that space, we pick up the story in chapter 16 and 17, and it's a little bit confusing because, and even theologians discuss whether 16 should have come before 17, but we know in those early years, two things happened. He is called to the palace to play the harp for a crazy king who pretty much started to lose his mind completely after God said he wasn't his choice anymore. He's called to the palace to play music for him, and he kills Goliath. The reason why we're not sure which one of those two come first is chapter 16, it says that he plays the harp and Saul loves him. But in chapter 17, when he slays Goliath, Saul doesn't know him from a bar of soap. So we think very possibly that he's killed Goliath before he played the harp. But that's minor details. Early years, he's drawn to the palace. He knows what he's doing there because he's been anointed as king. Saul is very quickly going to figure out why he's there. He might step in. The youngsters of today, if you speak to anyone that employs anyone under the age of 25, already wants to be boss. They watched a YouTube clip, so they know how to manage better than you. And they're on Instagram, and they listen to Jordan Peterson, so they're already a better dad than you, even though they don't even know what that entails. And so the reality is, he may have been tempted just to step in and take over, but he comes in there humbly, and he sings his music, and he does what he needs to do. In that space, in those early years, in chapter 18, it says, Saul took him, and in that space, there came a time where he decided, okay, my boy, you're mine. You're not allowed going back to your father's house anymore. And in that space began the manipulation of Paul and the controlling spirit that God would use to mold his new king. He had no freedom. He had very little possession. And he was sent out again and again and again and again to do the work of the king. And the king was happy because he was succeeding and he was doing him good and he was winning. In that space, another character comes on the scene, Jonathan. And I pray that we would all have a Jonathan in our lives. I pray that the Saul would be a softie. I pray that we would all have a Jonathan. Because Jonathan became an amazing brother, an amazing friend. And it goes again, I'm going to highlight in a bit how important community is no matter what struggle we go through. But how God put a man of peace in his life. Even though it was one of his darkest seasons, he had a brother. He had a friend that was there to protect him. And the beautiful thing about Jonathan is Jonathan was actually legally the heir to the throne. But not once do we ever pick that up in the story. We never see any animosity. In actual fact, Jonathan gives his sword and his clothing to David as a symbol of, I see the hand of God on you and I endorse you for the king. In actual fact, a little bit later when Saul finally loses it and he says to Jonathan, if this man is not killed, you will never have a kingdom of your own. And Jonathan still refuses to kill his friend. And so other than the fact that he had a brother through all of this that protected him from the mad king, that eventually told him, okay, it's time to call it quits. You need to go. You need to leave. You need to leave now. He always had a brother to lean on. And you will find that even in your darkest hours, if you look closely, there will always be a brother or a sister to lead you through. There will always be a man of peace. If you're a born-again Christian, God will always have something. If you're not a born-again Christian and you find yourself in a hard space, look, you will find that person. And come on, the word of God isn't limited to countries where you can just be a Christian. If you find yourself overseas and there isn't a church for 300 kilometers, I've shared the story once before about another book I read. He came to set the captives free, about an English man in a foreign Thai prison, just alone and broken and desperate, and he stuck his hand in a little crack of a rock in one of the largest, most notorious prisons in the world, looking for a bug to eat. And he found something other than a bug, and he pulled it out, and it was an English New Testament. And through that, he met Jesus, planted a church. Go read the book. South African man that's now planted a church there in secret behind a communist curtain, and his spreading the word. No matter where you are, there will be a man of peace to help you. David was still serving, he was still succeeding, he was still making Saul look good. In 1 Samuel 18 verse 5, David went out, he was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. This was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. But then something changed. Say, dum, 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 dum. There you go. Don't do that again. Samuel 18:6, and they were coming home when David returned from striking down the Philistines. And the woman came out of all of the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, with musical instruments. And they were singing, Saul has struck down thousands, and Saul was dancing thousands. I say thousands, you say who? Saul! They were having fun. They were having fun. Saul was enjoying the fame. And then they said, and they carried on to sing, and they said, and they ascribed to David 10,000s. And Saul stopped in his tracks all of a sudden. And most of us would, come on, he works for him. Can you imagine someone that works for you? They're busy writing an article in the Lowfeld about how amazing your business is that you've built up over the years. They highlight your salesman and make him sound 10 times better than you. Most of us would go, excuse me, what is going on here? Saul busy rearing his head inside. I taught him everything he knows. How dare they? And in that space it says in verse 9, and Saul eyed David from that day. So in that space, the first big test that we see Saul and David facing with each other is the comparison test. And we all do it. We all do it. Comparison clouds clarity of calling. That's its greatest misgiving. It clouds clarity of calling. We see years down the line, David has eventually left the palace for fear of his life. He's hiding in caves. He's very possibly in exile. Theologians would guess for at least 7 years, maybe longer, running between caves, hiding in the bush, hiding in the hill country. And Saul, it says, hunts him down every single day. It's years since he's left, and he cannot. He's not even leading his nation anymore. His nation's falling apart because he's been distracted by comparison. We just finished preaching a sermonized version of our church's identity course. We finished on Friday. If you haven't done it, you need to do it. It's amazing. And the last chapter in the identity course, and sometimes we say this is such a cliche, it's a bumper sticker, but on the back of this amazing course of building into our identity and examining the fight that the world has to try and give us an identity that isn't our own, try to make us someone that God didn't make us to be, as we're molded by the hurts of people that have broken us down and situations that have broken us down over years. The final chapter is this. It is God's greatest dream. It is His greatest vision. It is your greatest destiny to become the best version of yourself. And you find that version of yourself by looking deep and saying, what am I good at? What are my passions? What are my spiritual gifts? What are my experiences? He doesn't want you to be anyone other than you. The best version of you. And comparison will rob you of that gift. We see that as we move on from the comparison test, and you can chew and pray on that for many, many years to come. You'll never stop comparing yourself. Ever, ever, ever. As long as it shows you what you need of God and not what you need of someone else, and points you towards Him and doesn't take your eyes off Him. The next test that David needed to face was the test of being attacked. Now, attack comes in many different forms, many different ways. You see in the scripture I just read in 1 Samuel 18:9, Saul started to eye him differently from that day. From verse 10 it says, the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. David's busy singing his psalms there, minding his own business. As the deer panteth for... Whoa, whoa, what? what's that? Yeah. It's like, if you didn't like my voice, you should have just said so, bro. Hey? Yo. Later on, Saul continues to try and kill him in many, many different ways. He sends him to the front lines. He promises him one of his daughters, then takes her and gives her to someone else. He tries to convince Jonathan to kill him. He tries to convince his slaves to kill him. He throws spears on many, many more occasions. And eventually he puts out the word that he's persona non grata. He is to be pursued. What do we do when we come under attack? Now, this is a very dangerous message for me to preach online and to a church where I don't know the situation you're in. Because your attack could look very different to a mad king throwing spears at you. It could be someone taking advantage of you in the workplace. It could be someone taking advantage of you physically. It could be you being in an abusive marriage. It could be you being in an abusive relationship where your parents or one of your parents is still manipulating you and it's taking a toll on your existent family. They make you feel bad for not visiting. Are my parents here? No, they don't. That's definitely not my parents. My mom's babysitting my kids here somewhere. Your attack could look very different. And so we can look at the example that God lays out for us. And there are other times where David doesn't follow the example with Saul specifically. For example, a little bit later on, he's camping in the hill countries, and there's a very rich farmer next to where he's been staying called Nabal. And so David politely sends a group of young men to Nabal to say, hey, dude, we've been in and around your area for a while. While we were here, not a sheep went missing. We protected you. We looked after you. Would you mind maybe sending us a sheep or two just so we can eat? Nabal vips himself. He says, not a chance. You freeloaders. I'm not helping you. So David vips himself and he straps up with swords and everything. And he says to his guys, we're going to slaughter his whole household. There isn't going to be a man left in his house. Not a slave. We're gone. Off he goes. So he's ready to go sort him out. Fortunately, Nabal's wife was very clever and apparently quite pretty. She loaded up some donkeys with some food. She met David along the way. She begged for forgiveness. She gave him like 5 sheep on a spit. I mean, what can you say to that? He said, thank you so much for saving me from sinning. Later on, Nabal died and he took Abigail as his wife. She clearly made an impression on him. And so the reality is, sometimes we are called to defend ourselves. Even in Luke chapter 12, verse 11, and most of our attacks today would be verbal attacks. Some of them spiritual, some of them on our character. But even in Luke chapter 12, verse 11, it says, and when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourself or what you should say. So this requires discernment. When do I fight? When do I back off? But discernment only comes from seeking godly counsel from God and Jonathan and Abigail and the godly people that God has brought into our lives. We all have the tendency to be a Saul. And even if we're going to be tempted to defend ourselves, we need to make sure that it's not because of paranoia. It's not because of insecurity. It's not because of jealousy, which were the trademarks of Saul. If you're going to defend yourself, it needs to be for godly reasons. And so I want to read another excerpt from this beautiful book that I mentioned a moment ago. And it reads like this. What do you do when spears are thrown at you? Everyone else in the world knows what to do when a spear is thrown at them. You pick up the spear and you throw it back. And in doing the small feat of returning thrown spears, you prove many things. You are courageous. You stand for what's right. You boldly stand against the wrong. You are tough. You cannot be pushed around. You're the defender of the faith, the keeper of the flame, and the detector of heresy. You will not be wronged. All of these attributes can combine to prove that you are also obviously a candidate for kingship. You probably are supposed to be the boss, okay? Yes, perhaps you are the Lord's anointed, after the order of King Saul. There is also a possibility that some 20 years after your coronation, you will be the most incredibly skilled spear thrower in all the kingdom, and most assuredly by them, quite mad. If you fight evil for evil, you are just as bad as them. If you fight wrong with wrong, you are just as bad as them. You have a right to defend yourself. But depending on how you do it, what will the cost be? It's a painful thing to go through. But if you don't get bitter, you can make it. And God does use broken vessels to bring healing in a broken world. You see, in my line of work, certain things give certain pastors permission to preach certain messages. Certain experiences give pastors permission to preach certain messages. Greg Garrett, who is the man who ordained me onto eldership, lost his wife to cancer. And after that experience in his life, an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone, he preached a message on loss that carried a different anointing to a message I would preach on loss. It's why some people might call it the school of suffering or the school of pain. As a young man, one of the last of the Gen Xers, slightly influenced by the millennials, I thought I could be a motivational speaker. Now, you see, at church, you have to listen to me. Out there, when they pay $350 a head or whatever it was 20 years ago, you got to have something to offer. And a joke isn't enough. They want to know how you survived the shark attack, or how you are so interesting without any arms and legs, or what it was like to make it through a war zone, or how you survived stepping on a landmine. You see, there are certain things in life that you go through that may not be nice, but they give you permission to speak. They give you license to act. Suffering produces endurance, according to the scripture. And endurance, character. Suffering produces. It is a production. So when you're being attacked, we're tempted to take revenge. Defend truth on social media. Have you ever been onto a thread where Christians are trying to defend something on social media? I want to call myself something else. A Jesus follower, or a something other than those evil people destroying lives on social media, hiding behind the wall of a profile. Hatred and bigotry. Will we fight evil with evil? This is how you make it through an attack in your life. You trust God, you walk in love, and you honor everyone. You see, as you examine the life of David, there were times in his life where he was able to kill Saul. There were times in his life, one of the times in the cave, it says that Saul came to relieve himself. The Bible is so comical. Came to relieve himself, and David was right there next to him, and his men in the cave were shouting, "Kill him!" Well, not shouting, "Kill him, kill him, kill him, kill him." I think it was after one of those that one of his unwritten psalms were penned. Mama, I didn't kill a man. I crept up just beside. He didn't see me, I can hide. Mama, it stunk so bad. Thank you, Jesus. Now you know why I preach and don't lead worship. I want to read one more excerpt out of this book. You can easily tell when someone has been hit by a spear, according to Gene Edwards. He turns a deep shade of bitter. David never got hit. Gradually, he learned a very well-kept secret. Number one, never learn anything about the fashionable, easily mastered art of spear throwing. Stay out of the company of all spear throwers. And keep your mouth tightly closed. In this way, spears will never touch you, even when they pierce your heart. Don't learn the ways of Saul. We're nearly done. David goes into the caves for the final stint of his ministry. And this is the final test I want to mention. And this is the test of isolation, the test of exile, the test of not being noticed, the test of not being recognized. Anointed, but not yet appointed. The test of feeling you deserve, but you didn't get. The test of feeling like you want, but you don't have yet. The test of unfulfilled dreams and unfulfilled promises. What will we do in that season? So David flees the palace where he's taking knocks. He flees he loses his mind really. And in that brief action of fleeing, he almost becomes a Saul. It even says he acted like Saul on purpose. He flees out the window. His wife, Michal, says, "Run for your life, Davy." Out he goes. He flees. He goes to a priest's house. He says, he lies. First mistake. He says, "I'm on a special mission, but I had to pack so fast, I don't have a weapon." So the priest says, "I don't have anything here." But wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod is Goliath's sword. That should have been a wake-up call, man. What? I was so strong, so confident in life. He says, "Give me the sword. I need it." He then rushes to the city of Goliath. He gets there thinking they will give him refuge. And as he gets there, he hears them singing the song that David killed 10,000s. He realized those 10,000s were Philistines. He's made a massive mistake. And it says, so he acted like Saul and became like a madman, frothing at the mouth. So in his moment of weakness, he becomes like Saul. Fortunately, he collects himself and he goes and finds himself in a cave. And then God, his family hears about it. Think about it. Saul looks for him for pretty much an average close to about 10 years. Within a day, his family finds him and they come and rescue him. His father's household found out he was in the cave, and there came his brothers. 7 of them, and his dad. And there they were, protecting their boy. You see, in isolation, if you take your cry to God, there will be a community of safety. It's not difficult to find. Go on the church app. It's called a home group. There will be a community to lift you up. So first thing he did, and we can tell by the Psalms, he cried out to God, not with songs of Queen, but in songs of desperation. Number 2, he didn't stay isolated. He accepted the help of God. The help of God came in the form of family. And then it came in the form of a massive community. But even in that community, herein lay a test. It says in 1 Samuel 22 verse 2, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was a bitter soul, gathered to him. Everyone that had a reason to skinner and complain and drag him deeper into the cave than ever before. This community built around him of fellow evildoers, of fellow moaners, of fellow disgruntled workers. And he could have so easily snuck and dug himself deeper and deeper into the complaining, gossiping, negative world. But it says he led them. He became a commander over them, and there were around him 400 men. Rest assured, if anything has happened to you in any community that is negative, misery loves company. You will find someone quickly with an ear to hear your complaint and one to make it grow even bigger. Many years ago, I was part of another church. And I felt called to leave that church. And I had one prayer and one prayer only. When I leave, don't let anyone follow me. That was my prayer. I thank God for the new family he planted me into. I thank God for what I learned in the old family. And when we do looking in times over here and people consider to come join the church, the intro speech goes, if you've left another church, leave it well. Truth is, I probably know the pastor and he's going to tell me what you did wrong anyway. Leave it well. Don't fire a shotgun over your shoulder. Misery loves company. Lead that conversation well. Stop it in its tracks and don't entertain the spear throwing. And we must turn our wilderness into a training ground. Turn your wilderness into a training ground. And we do that by asking 3 questions. Why am I here? What do I need to learn? And how can I make the most of this time? Why am I here? What do I need to learn? And how can I make the most of this time? I was fired from a job once upon a time, many years ago. When I share this story, I say I'm the only person that was ever fired because it was his fault. Anyone else that was ever fired was fired because their boss was an idiot. I was fired because I was an idiot. And the reality is, I was young. I spent too much time in the gym, not that you can tell now. You see, anything you compromise to keep, you will eventually lose. It's just a spiritual law of the land. But I had so much to learn there. I had so much to learn in that experience about controlling myself, disciplining myself. And I even decided I was going to hide that information when applying to the job that pretty much set me up to establish myself and my family and my home. I left it off the CV. And I made it to the short list. And I was so scared because I'd lied. I didn't lie, I just left something out. I phoned the guy back and he told me already, you're not qualified for this job, but there's something about you that I like. You can come for the interview. And I phoned him. I said, sir, I got to tell you, please, can I send you a different CV? I left out a small detail. I was fired. He was not happy. I thought I'd shot myself in the foot. I went for the interview with the new CV, and my receptionist at the new company was the receptionist at the company I was fired from. Jesus, thank you. The last point I want to give you in what happens when you find yourself in this season. And I read Isaiah 1 Samuel 30 verse 6. It was in a very difficult time of David's life in this space. He had come back from trying to defend the Philistines, and the entire place they lived had been ransacked. Every man had lost wife, child, livestock, and they wanted to stone him. And David was greatly distressed. It had probably been about 15 years. It was just before his final breakthrough. Just in that space, the battle that he retreated from was the battle that Saul and his sons were killed at. He was in the final throes, the final calm before the storm. And he was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him because all the people were bitter in soul, each of his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. And we need to learn how to be our own encouragement in God. The community's there and the word is there, but you need to be the first encourager. You need to be able to go into your quiet space. You need to go into yourself with God and pick up yourself by your bootstraps and encourage yourself in God. Take ownership of the process and say, God, I know why I'm here. I know what I need to learn. We're nearly there.